Our journey into the grand, turbulent saga of the Trojan War, as immortalized in Homer's The Iliad, truly begins not on a battlefield, but at a wedding. A celestial celebration, in fact. Imagine, if you will, the most exclusive guest list imaginable. All the gods and goddesses of Olympus gathered to witness the union of the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, parents-to-be of the legendary Achilles. It was, by all accounts, a fabulous affair, brimming with ambrosia, nectar, and probably some divine karaoke. But as with any good party, there's always one uninvited guest, isn't there? In this case, it was Eris, the goddess of discord, who, perhaps feeling a bit left out, decided to spice things up a tad. She tossed a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," into the midst of the goddesses, knowing full well the chaos it would unleash. Talk about a party pooper, or perhaps a party starter, depending on your perspective. This seemingly innocuous act led to the infamous judgment of Paris, a moment that echoes through history as one of the ultimate beauty contests. Three powerful goddesses immediately laid claim to the apple: Hera, the queen of the gods; Athena, the wise goddess of war; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Now, picking a winner from this divine trio was a task no god dared undertake. So Zeus, ever the delegator, pawned the decision off on a mortal, Paris, a prince of Troy, who, unbeknownst to him, was tending sheep on Mount Ida. Historians still argue whether Zeus genuinely sought an impartial judge or simply relished the impending drama. Paris, who, let's be honest, probably had no idea what he was getting into beyond judging a very high-stakes livestock show, was approached by the goddesses, each offering an irresistible bribe. Hera promised him power and a vast kingdom. Athena offered wisdom and military glory, and Aphrodite, well, she offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, already married to King Menelaus. Now, if you're keeping score at home, Aphrodite's offer was a bit ethically dubious, given Helen's marital status. But Paris, being a young man with perhaps a touch more ambition in his heart than wisdom, chose love, or at least the promise of the world's most stunning human. This decision, seemingly a simple choice between three dazzling ladies and their equally dazzling bribes, effectively signed the death warrant for countless heroes and an entire city. It's a classic example of how one seemingly small, personal choice can have monumental, globe-altering consequences. Remember that golden apple? It effectively became a cosmic hand grenade, its pin pulled by a pastoral prince. The abduction of Helen, orchestrated by Aphrodite and carried out by Paris, was the direct catalyst for the Trojan War. Helen, renowned throughout the ancient world for her unparalleled beauty, became the face that launched 1,000 ships. Whether she went willingly with Paris, captivated by his charm and Aphrodite's influence, or was abducted against her will, remains a point of scholarly contention, adding another layer of intrigue to this foundational moment. Some ancient accounts paint her as a willing eloper, swept away by passion, while others portray her as a tragic victim, snatched from her home. Regardless, her disappearance was a profound insult to Menelaus, and by extension, to all of Greece. Imagine waking up one morning to find your spouse, the most beautiful person you know, has eloped with a foreign prince who just happened to be the judge of a divine beauty contest. Not exactly a typical Tuesday, is it? This personal affront to Menelaus quickly escalated into a national crisis for the Achaeans, as the Greeks were known. The violation of xenia, the sacred ancient Greek custom of guest friendship, was seen as an offense against the gods themselves. Menelaus, incandescent with rage and humiliation, appealed to his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae and arguably the most influential of the Greek rulers. Agamemnon, a man with a keen eye for prestige and power, saw in this outrage an opportunity not just to avenge his brother's honor, but also to assert Greek dominance over the wealthy and strategically important city of Troy. And so, the wheels of war began to turn, set in motion by a single golden apple, a shepherd's choice, and the irresistible allure of a woman's beauty. It truly highlights how seemingly innocuous events can unravel into earth-shattering conflicts, a timeless lesson humanity seems to perpetually relearn. With Helen's abduction casting a long shadow over the Greek world, the call to arms reverberated across kingdoms, summoning heroes and their armies to avenge Menelaus's honor and uphold the sanctity of Greek hospitality. Agamemnon, the shrewd and ambitious king of Mycenae, spearheaded this monumental undertaking. He dispatched envoys, messengers, and probably the ancient equivalent of viral marketing campaigns, reminding every Greek ruler of their oath, sworn long ago to defend Helen's honor should she ever be wronged. It was a clever piece of political maneuvering, binding disparate kingdoms together under a shared cause, even if some of the participants were less enthusiastic than others. The rendezvous point for this massive undertaking was Aulis, a coastal town where the vast Achaean fleet began to assemble. Imagine the sheer scale. Thousands of ships, warriors from across the Greek mainland and islands, all converging on one spot. This wasn't just a few fishing boats. This was the ancient world's equivalent of a D-Day invasion, requiring immense logistical prowess. We're talking about provisioning for tens of thousands of men, organizing encampments, and managing the egos of myriad kings, each accustomed to being the big fish in their own small pond. It must have been a chaotic, boisterous, and surprisingly well-organized mess. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some sources suggest that the winds at Aulis were so persistently contrary that the ships couldn't set sail for weeks, perhaps even months, creating immense frustration among the assembled forces. It's hard to keep an army motivated when they're just sitting around, waiting for a breeze. However, the fleet's departure was not merely delayed by fickle winds. It was obstructed by divine displeasure. The goddess Artemis, incensed by an offense committed by Agamemnon, either killing a sacred stag or boasting about his hunting prowess, historians still argue which exact transgression it was, demanded a horrifying sacrifice to appease her wrath. Iphigenia, Agamemnon's own daughter. This was a truly brutal demand, testing the limits of a father's love against his duty to his people and his ambition for glory. Agamemnon, facing pressure from his eager-to-depart army and the dire consequences of displeasing a goddess, made the agonizing choice to proceed with the sacrifice. The story goes that Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the pretense of marrying Achilles, a cruel deception designed to ensure her presence. The scene at Aulis, with Iphigenia on the altar, ready to be sacrificed, is one of the most poignant and debated moments in Greek mythology. Did Agamemnon truly go through with it? Some versions of the myth claim that Artemis, at the last moment, substituted a deer for Iphigenia, whisking the girl away to serve as her priestess in Taris. Others insist the sacrifice was completed, leaving an indelible stain on Agamemnon's soul and sowing the seeds of future familial tragedy. This particular ambiguity highlights a recurring theme in ancient narratives: the blurred lines between divine intervention and human decision, where the gods often seem to push mortals into impossible moral quandaries. It's almost like a cosmic reality TV show, but with much higher stakes and less predictable outcomes. Once the divine hurdle was cleared, whether by sacrifice or substitution, the winds finally shifted, and the vast Achaean armada set sail for Troy. This was not a short cruise. The journey across the Aegean Sea, with thousands of relatively primitive ships, would have been an epic undertaking in itself. Remember, these weren't modern cruisers with GPS. Navigation was by stars and sheer grit. The very sight of this approaching fleet, numbering in the hundreds, if not thousands, must have sent shivers down the spines of the Trojan defenders had they known what was coming. The Greeks, often called the Argives or Danaans in the Iliad, were a formidable fighting force, led by their most renowned heroes. Among these leaders were the aforementioned Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, whose mother was Thetis. Remember that wedding? The cunning Odysseus, king of Ithaca, known for his intellect and trickery. The mighty Ajax, a towering figure of brute strength. And Nestor, the wise and aged king of Pylos, whose counsel was highly valued. Each brought their own contingents, their own glory, and their own rivalries to the expedition. The assembly at Aulis wasn't just a military muster. It was a gathering of legendary figures, each destined to play a crucial role in the unfolding drama. This grand coalition, driven by honor, vengeance, and perhaps a dash of imperial ambition, was now on a collision course with the formidable city of Troy, a confrontation that would echo through millennia and shape the very foundations of Western literature. After what must have felt like an eternity of waiting, divine appeasement, and finally a favorable breeze, the vast Achaean armada sliced through the Aegean, its sights set firmly on the imposing walls of Troy. However, reaching Troy wasn't the end of their troubles. It was merely the beginning of a protracted and grueling struggle that would define the next 9 years. This wasn't a quick smash-and-grab operation, folks. The Trojans, under their wise King Priam, and led by their formidable champion, Prince Hector, were no pushovers. Their city, perched strategically atop a hill, was heavily fortified, renowned for its strong walls, a testament to ancient engineering prowess. Historians still argue about the exact location and nature of these walls, though archaeological evidence at Hisarlik, modern-day Turkey, certainly suggests a powerful ancient settlement. The initial encounters were likely chaotic and bloody. Imagine thousands of exhausted, seasick warriors disembarking onto a hostile shore, met by determined defenders. It wasn't glorious charges and immediate victories. It was a grind. The Achaeans, for all their strength and numbers, found themselves facing a well-prepared and fiercely patriotic populace. The early years of the war settled into a frustrating stalemate, a series of skirmishes, raids and sieges that lacked any decisive breakthrough. It was less about grand-pitched battles and more about constant attrition, a slow bleeding for both sides. The Greeks couldn't simply breach Troy's formidable defenses, and the Trojans, while capable of defending their city, lacked the offensive power to drive the Achaeans entirely from their shores. During this long, drawn-out period, the Achaeans often resorted to raiding surrounding towns and territories to gather supplies and plunder, a necessary evil to feed and maintain their massive army. These excursions, while providing resources, also diverted forces and sometimes led to new conflicts. It was during one of these raids, for instance, that Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, captured Briseis, a war prize who would later become central to his famous rage. This period of raiding wasn't glamorous. It was the unromantic, logistical reality of ancient warfare, a gritty existence filled with dust, disease, and dwindling morale. Think of it as the ultimate extended camping trip, but with significantly more spears and significantly less s'mores. The narrative of the Iliad largely focuses on the 10th and final year of the war, a testament to how uneventful, from a dramatic standpoint, the preceding 9 years might have been. Homer, in his brilliant storytelling, largely glosses over this decade-long grind, giving us only glimpses of the monotony and frustration that must have permeated the Achaean camp. This long duration also created a unique dynamic within the Greek forces. Many of the heroes had grown weary, longing for home and their families. The initial fervor of vengeance had likely cooled, replaced by a grim determination to see the conflict to its end, whatever the cost. The men were tired, the provisions were often short, and the initial unity might have frayed at the edges. There's a quirky tidbit about these 9 years. Some ancient accounts suggest that the Achaeans built a massive wall around their own camp, facing the sea, as a defensive measure against potential Trojan counterattacks or raids. This indicates a degree of permanence and a tacit admission that the war would not be a swift victory. Imagine building a defensive wall while you're the invading force. It really underscores the difficulty of their position. This wall, later breached by the Trojans, becomes a significant plot point in the Iliad, symbolizing the shifting tides of battle and the very real threat the Greeks faced. The psychological toll of this protracted conflict must have been immense on both sides. For the Trojans, it was a constant siege, a daily reminder of the external threat to their city and way of life. For the Achaeans, it was a war of attrition, far from home, with the constant worry of ambushes, the deaths of comrades, and the gnawing question of when or if they would ever return to Greece. This long stalemate served to harden both sides, forging seasoned veterans out of eager recruits and deepening the animosity that fueled the conflict. The ground around Troy became soaked with the blood of countless skirmishes, a testament to a war that refused to yield a quick victor. The stage was set for the dramatic events of the final year, a year that would unleash the full fury of gods and mortals alike. After 9 long, grinding years of inconclusive skirmishes and frustrating sieges, the Achaean camp around Troy was a powder keg, ripe for internal conflict. And explode it did, not with a bang of battle, but with the quiet fury of Achilles' rage. This wasn't just a petty squabble, it was a fundamental clash of egos, authority, and divine favor that threatened to unravel the entire Greek enterprise. The spark that ignited this conflagration was, fittingly, another war prize, a woman named Chryses. You see, during one of those interminable raiding expeditions, a raid that probably seemed like just another dreary day at the office, the Achaeans had captured Chryses, daughter of a priest of Apollo. As was the custom, she was awarded to Agamemnon, the supreme commander. All seemed well and good, until Chryses, the distraught father and priest, arrived at the Greek camp, pleading for his daughter's return and offering a hefty ransom. Agamemnon, perhaps feeling particularly proud or simply being his usual arrogant self, rudely dismissed the priest, boasting about his ownership of the girl. Big mistake. Huge. Chryses, heartbroken and furious, prayed to Apollo, his patron god, for vengeance, and Apollo, ever protective of his priests, delivered. He rained down a devastating plague upon the Achaean forces. The men sickened and died in droves, arrows of disease flying invisibly through the camp, an unseen enemy far more terrifying than any Trojan spear. This mainstream historical fact of ancient warfare, plague, was a constant, devastating threat, often attributed to divine wrath. The Achaean army, already weary from years of war, began to collapse from within. Recognizing the catastrophe, Achilles, a man of action and keen perception, convened an assembly. He summoned Calchas, the prophet, who, under Achilles' protection, bravely revealed the cause of the plague: Apollo's anger over Agamemnon's disrespect towards Chryses. The solution, Calchas declared, was simple. Chryseis must be returned to her father without ransom. This revelation put Agamemnon squarely on the spot, publicly shamed and held accountable for the suffering of his men. His pride, however, refused to bend easily. Agamemnon, spitting with indignation, reluctantly agreed to return Chryseis, but not without demanding a replacement. And his choice of replacement? Briseis, Achilles' own war prize, a woman Achilles deeply cherished. This wasn't just about a woman. It was a profound insult, a public humiliation of the greatest warrior in the Achaean army by his own commander. It was a blatant abuse of power, designed to assert Agamemnon's dominance and remind everyone who was truly in charge. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's primary motivation was genuine need for a new prize or pure, unadulterated spite. Achilles, incandescent with fury, felt his honor violated in the most grievous way. He drew his sword, contemplating striking down Agamemnon then and there. Only the timely intervention of Athena, sent by Hera to restrain him, prevented a bloody civil war within the Greek ranks. Think about that for a second. The entire expedition, years of effort, nearly crumbled because of two powerful men's stubborn pride and a perceived slight. It's almost like a very dramatic, very violent office spat. Despite Athena's intervention, Achilles' decision was firm. If his honor was so easily trampled upon, if his commander could so brazenly disrespect him, then he would no longer fight. He declared that he and his mighty Myrmidons, his elite fighting force, would withdraw entirely from the battle. He would simply sit by his ships, watching as the Achaeans suffered, a grim witness to Agamemnon's folly. This was not a bluff. Achilles was a man of his word, especially when it came to his honor. This dramatic withdrawal of the Achaeans' most potent weapon had immediate and devastating consequences for the Greek forces, shifting the balance of power dramatically in favor of the Trojans. The greatest warrior, the one man capable of turning the tide of any battle, was now a disgruntled spectator, choosing spite over victory. The very fate of the expedition hung precariously in the balance, dangling by a thread of human ego. With Achilles, the Achaeans' mightiest warrior, brooding in his tent, and his formidable myrmidons idly polishing their spears by the ships, the balance of power in the Trojan War shifted dramatically. What had been a frustrating stalemate for 9 years suddenly tilted decisively in favor of the Trojans. This vacuum of Achaean strength allowed Hector, the eldest son of King Priam and the undisputed champion of Troy, to truly shine. Hector was not just a fierce warrior, he was a courageous leader, beloved by his people, and utterly devoted to the defense of his city and family. Unlike Achilles, who fought largely for personal glory and honor, Hector fought for Troy's very survival. Hector seized this opportunity, rallying the Trojan forces and leading them in a series of relentless and devastating attacks. With Achilles' terrifying presence removed from the battlefield, the Trojan morale soared, fueled by the hope of finally driving the invaders back into the sea. The Achaeans, on the other hand, found themselves in desperate straits. Their previous confidence wavered, replaced by a grim awareness of their vulnerability. Imagine a star football team losing its star quarterback. That's roughly the impact Achilles' absence had on the Greek side. This shift in momentum is a classic example of how individual leadership, or its absence, can profoundly impact military campaigns. The narrative of the Iliad vividly portrays the Trojans' surging confidence and the Greeks' escalating despair. Hector, described as man-slaughtering and of the gleaming helmet, was everywhere on the battlefield, a whirlwind of destruction. He broke through the Achaean lines, slew their champions, and consistently pushed them back towards their heavily fortified camp, a place they had once considered impregnable. It was a humiliating retreat for the proud Achaeans who were accustomed to being the aggressors. You can almost hear the shouts of the victorious Trojans echoing across the plain, a stark contrast to the grim silence of the retreating Greeks. One of Hector's most significant achievements during this period was breaching the Achaean wall. That defensive barrier the Greeks had constructed to protect their ships and camp. This was a monumental feat, symbolizing the complete reversal of fortunes. For years, the wall had stood as a bulwark, a symbol of Greek permanence on Trojan soil. Its breach meant the Trojans were now fighting on Greek terms, threatening their very escape routes. Historians still argue about the exact composition of this wall, whether it was truly a massive stone structure or more of a rampart of earth and timber. Whatever its material, its psychological significance was immense. The pressure on the Achaeans became almost unbearable. Hector, with the divine backing of Zeus, who had promised Thetis to aid the Trojans in punishing Agamemnon, drove the Greeks all the way back to their ships. The very sight of Trojan fires burning dangerously close to their beached vessels was a terrifying prospect. This was not merely a defeat, it was an existential threat. The Greeks were on the verge of being trapped and annihilated, their hopes of victory dwindling with every successful Trojan advance. It was a dire situation, a far cry from the glorious conquest they had envisioned a decade earlier. There's a quirky tidbit about this period. It's said that the Trojan horse, which later became central to their downfall, was actually conceived of by Odysseus during this very period of despair. A last-ditch, desperate plan hatched when all conventional military strategies seem to fail. While this detail isn't explicitly in the Iliad, it highlights the depth of the Achaean desperation. Their backs were against the wall, literally, and the smell of defeat hung heavy in the air. The Achaeans tried to appease Achilles, sending their greatest champions, including Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, with lavish gifts and apologies, begging him to return to battle. But Achilles, stubborn in his wrath, refused, his anger at Agamemnon outweighing even the pleas of his desperate comrades. He was, to put it mildly, having a colossal sulk, and it was costing his people dearly. The stage was now set for the next tragic turn, one that would finally force Achilles to abandon his vengeful idleness. As the Trojan flames licked closer to the Achaean ships, casting an ominous glow on the desperate faces of the Greek warriors, the gravity of Achilles' absence became agonizingly clear. While Agamemnon and the other commanders scrambled, trying to stem the tide, one man watched the unfolding catastrophe with growing despair: Patroclus. Patroclus wasn't merely Achilles' best friend. He was his closest confidant, his soulmate, and a formidable warrior in his own right, though overshadowed by the sheer brilliance of Achilles. Their bond was legendary, a deep affection that transcended typical camaraderie. Patroclus, seeing his comrades slaughtered and the very fleet on the brink of destruction, could no longer bear to stand idly by. His heart ached for the suffering Greeks, and the sight of the mighty Ajax and Odysseus, once invincible, now wounded and struggling, spurred him to action. He approached Achilles, his face etched with a mixture of grief and urgent pleading. This wasn't a casual chat. This was a desperate appeal, the culmination of days of agonizing witness to his people's decimation. He eloquently described the horrific state of the Achaean army, listing the wounded heroes and emphasizing the dire threat to their entire expedition. In a scene charged with emotion, Patroclus made his fervent plea to Achilles. He didn't ask Achilles to set aside his wrath entirely. He knew the depth of Achilles' stubborn pride. Instead, he proposed a compromise, a solution that would strike fear into the Trojans without forcing Achilles to break his vow. Patroclus requested permission to wear Achilles' legendary armor into battle. This was a stroke of genius, a tactical deception designed to mislead the Trojans into believing Achilles himself had returned. Imagine the psychological impact: the sudden appearance of the dreaded Achilles on the battlefield after his long absence. It would be like a superhero suddenly reappearing when all hope seemed lost. Achilles, though still simmering with rage against Agamemnon, was deeply moved by Patroclus's distress and the plight of his comrades. His compassion, a rare glimpse beneath his fiery exterior, wrestled with his unwavering pride. He knew the risk, understood the weight of what Patroclus was asking. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart and a strict warning, Achilles granted Patroclus permission. He insisted that Patroclus only drive the Trojans away from the ships and avoid pursuing them too far, fearing for his friend's safety and perhaps still clinging to the hope that he would be the one to achieve ultimate glory. This condition, tragically, Patroclus would later ignore. This moment underscores a mainstream historical fact of ancient warfare and leadership: the power of symbolism and psychological warfare. The sight of Achilles' armor, shining like fire, was intended to sow panic and confusion among the Trojans, exploiting their long-standing fear of the greatest Greek warrior. It was a brilliant tactic, relying on reputation and perception to achieve a military objective. However, it also carried immense risk, as the deception could only last so long, and Patroclus, though brave, was not Achilles. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some accounts suggest that Achilles gave Patroclus explicit instructions not to engage Hector in single combat, knowing Hector's prowess and the potential danger. Whether this instruction was given and simply ignored in the heat of battle, or whether Patroclus felt confident enough to challenge Troy's champion, adds to the tragic irony of what was to follow. Historians still argue whether Patroclus's decision to advance beyond the ships was born of noble zeal, tactical necessity, or a fatal overconfidence fueled by wearing the armor of the invincible Achilles. The transformation of Patroclus, from empathetic observer to a warrior clad in the gleaming, iconic armor of Achilles, was complete. The scene was set for a dramatic turning point in the war, one fueled by a desperate gamble and the powerful bond of friendship. The Achaeans watched, their hearts soaring with renewed hope as Patroclus, shining like a god, entered the fray. The Trojans, initially terrified by the apparent return of Achilles, would soon discover the truth, but not before Patroclus inflicted significant damage, momentarily turning the tide of battle in favor of the struggling Greeks. The stage was set for both glory and immense sorrow, a dance of hope and despair that would ultimately reshape the narrative of the war. Clad in the awe-inspiring, glittering armor of Achilles, Patroclus burst onto the battlefield like a furious whirlwind, a beacon of hope for the beleaguered Achaeans and a terrifying phantom for the Trojans. The deception worked magnificently. The sight of the formidable Myrmidons, led by a figure that could only be Achilles, sent a wave of panic through the Trojan ranks. Their hard-won gains began to crumble under this unexpected assault. This swift psychological victory, fueled by the mere appearance of the armor, highlights a crucial mainstream historical fact of ancient warfare: the immense power of reputation and the psychological toll of fighting a renowned warrior. Patroclus, channeling the spirit of his friend and the desperation of his countrymen, fought with incredible ferocity. He drove the Trojans back from the ships, pushing them beyond the Achaean wall they had so recently breached. He slew many Trojan heroes, his spear flashing with deadly precision. The tide of battle turned decisively, and for a glorious, fleeting moment, it seemed as though Achilles himself had returned to lead the Greeks to victory. The Achaean cries of despair transformed into shouts of triumph, their morale soaring with every enemy fallen by Patroclus's hand. It was a remarkable display of courage and skill, proving that Patroclus was no mere sidekick, but a warrior of significant prowess in his own right. However, despite Achilles' strict warnings, the heat of battle, combined with his own surging triumph, led Patroclus to overextend himself. He pursued the retreating Trojans too far, pressing them all the way to the very walls of Troy. This was the moment of fatal overconfidence, the point where his noble zeal outweighed caution. Perhaps he felt invincible in Achilles' armor, or perhaps the sheer momentum of his success clouded his judgment. Historians still argue whether Patroclus's disregard for Achilles' instructions was a tragic flaw, an act of selfless heroism, or simply the chaotic inevitability of combat. As Patroclus reached the Scaean gates, the main entrance to Troy, his luck began to run out. The gods, who had largely stayed out of the direct fighting during Achilles' sulk, now intervened. Apollo, the very god whose plague had set this whole tragic chain of events in motion, actively participated in Patroclus' downfall. In a quirky tidbit of divine mischief, Apollo struck Patroclus from behind, clouding his mind, loosening his helmet, and weakening his limbs. This divine intervention made Patroclus vulnerable, stripping him of his initial momentum and the very armor that had given him his aura of invincibility. It was a cruel twist of fate, orchestrated by an unseen hand. Weakened and disoriented, Patroclus was then wounded by Euphorbus, a minor Trojan hero. The blow, though not fatal, further incapacitated him. It was then that Hector, Troy's champion, appeared, seeing his opportunity to reclaim the battlefield's momentum. Hector, who had previously been wary of the seemingly returned Achilles, now recognized that this was not the mighty Myrmidon king. With a final, decisive thrust, Hector drove his spear through Patroclus, dealing a mortal blow. The death of Patroclus was a pivotal moment in the Iliad, a turning point that reverberated through the very core of the epic. As he lay dying, Patroclus prophesied Hector's own imminent death at the hands of Achilles, a chilling warning that added a layer of tragic inevitability to the story. Hector, triumphant but perhaps unnerved by the prophecy, stripped Achilles' glorious armor from Patroclus' body, claiming it as his own spoil of war. The loss of Achilles' armor, now adorning his greatest enemy, would become another source of unbearable grief and fury for the grieving Achilles. The battle for Patroclus' body raged fiercely. The Achaeans, led by the great Ajax, fought desperately to retrieve their fallen comrade's corpse, while the Trojans, emboldened by their success, sought to further desecrate it. This grim struggle over a warrior's body was a common, brutal aspect of ancient warfare, deeply tied to honor and the proper rites for the dead. The Achaeans eventually succeeded in recovering Patroclus' body, though the glorious armor was lost. The news of Patroclus' death and the loss of his armor would soon reach Achilles, unleashing a storm of grief and vengeance unlike anything seen before. The war, which had seemed to stagnate, was about to enter its most brutal and defining phase. The news of Patroclus' death, delivered to Achilles by the swift-footed messenger Antilochus, struck the invincible warrior with a force more devastating than any spear. Achilles had withdrawn from battle due to wounded pride, but the loss of his beloved companion shattered his very soul. Homer describes his reaction with unparalleled raw emotion. Achilles covered his head with dust, groaned aloud, and tore at his hair, a profound display of agony that transcended mere grief. This moment is a powerful illustration of the deep emotional bonds that existed between warriors in ancient societies, a mainstream historical fact that highlights the personal cost of war beyond just physical injury. His lament was so loud and piercing that his mother, Thetis, heard it from the depths of the sea. She rose, surrounded by other sea nymphs, to comfort her son, but even divine solace could not quell the tempest raging within him. Achilles, who had defiantly chosen inaction, now found his carefully constructed wall of apathy utterly demolished. All his previous complaints about Agamemnon, all his injured pride, paled in comparison to the agonizing void left by Patroclus. The only thought that consumed him The only desire that burned in his heart was vengeance, not just victory, but a brutal, relentless, and all-consuming retribution against Hector, the slayer of his dearest friend. Achilles declared to his mother that he would return to battle, knowing full well the prophecy that linked Hector's death to his own. His return was no longer about personal glory or a quarrel with Agamemnon. It was a sacred quest for vengeance, a desperate attempt to honor the fallen Patroclus. This shift in motivation, from personal honor to profound grief, completely reshaped the narrative and injected a new, terrifying energy into the war. The Achaeans, already battered and demoralized, would soon witness the unbridled fury of their greatest champion, unleashed by the deepest sorrow. However, there was a significant problem. Patroclus had been wearing Achilles' magnificent armor, and Hector had stripped it from the dying Patroclus, now proudly wearing it himself. Achilles was, quite literally, disarmed. His mother Thetis, knowing his desperate need, journeyed to the workshop of Hephaestus, the divine smith, the god of fire and craftsmanship. This intervention by Thetis is a quirky tidbit, showcasing the unique relationship between Achilles and the gods, particularly his divine mother, who consistently acts as his advocate. Hephaestus, a master craftsman whose skill surpassed any mortals, readily agreed to forge new armor for Achilles. What he created was not just functional, it was a work of divine art, glittering like stars, adorned with intricate depictions of the cosmos, city life, warfare, and peace. The shield, in particular, was a masterpiece, a microcosm of the world, symbolizing the universal significance of the conflict Achilles was about to re-enter. This new armor was not merely protective gear, it was a statement, a divine endorsement of Achilles' impending wrath. Historians still argue about the symbolic weight of the shield's intricate depictions, whether it represented a longing for peace, a celebration of life, or a reflection of the cyclical nature of human existence and conflict. Clad in this divinely crafted panoply, Achilles was transformed. His eyes blazed with a terrifying light, his grief transmuted into an almost unbearable power. Before rejoining the fray, he finally, and somewhat anticlimactically after all the drama, reconciled with Agamemnon. The quarrel that had nearly destroyed the Achaean expedition now seemed trivial in the face of Patroclus's death. Agamemnon, humbled by the plague and the subsequent disasters, readily returned Briseis and offered lavish gifts, though these now seemed meaningless to the grieving Achilles. His focus was singular: vengeance. Achilles, remounted in his chariot, his divine armor gleaming, his heart, a crucible of sorrow and rage, roared onto the battlefield. His return was a seismic event, sending shockwaves of terror through the Trojan lines and igniting a desperate hope among the Achaeans. The long period of Achilles' sullen withdrawal was over. The stage was set for the climactic, brutal final acts of the Trojan War, fueled by the raw, consuming fury of a man who had nothing left to lose but his own life in the pursuit of vengeance. With Achilles back on the battlefield, cloaked in his radiant new armor forged by Hephaestus, the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his furious charge. This was no longer just a war between mortals. The re-entry of Achilles, fueled by divine wrath and grief, served as a potent signal for the Olympians to abandon their uneasy truce and fully engage in the conflict. What follows is a spectacular, chaotic, and often bewildering display of divine intervention, turning the battlefield into a cosmic chessboard where gods openly manipulated, aided, and hindered their chosen mortal champions. Zeus, the king of the gods, sensing that Achilles' overwhelming rage threatened to obliterate Troy prematurely, lifted his earlier prohibition on divine interference. He essentially gave the gods permission to pick sides and go wild. This decision highlights a mainstream historical fact in Greek mythology. The gods were not distant, benevolent figures, but often fickle, anthropomorphic beings deeply involved in human affairs, driven by their own desires, rivalries, and biases. They were, in essence, a very powerful, very dramatic extended family. And so, the Olympian gods descended, each throwing their weight behind their favored heroes or cities. Athena, ever the strategist and staunch supporter of the Achaeans, stood by Achilles, guiding his spear and lending him strength. Hera, consumed by her hatred for Troy, remember Paris's judgment and her spurned pride, likewise championed the Greeks. Poseidon, god of the sea, who had his own grievances against Troy for not paying him for their walls, a quirky tidbit of divine billing disputes, also lent his formidable power to the Achaean cause. Imagine the chaos, tidal waves, earthquakes, and sudden mists appearing and disappearing, all manipulated by an unseen hand. On the Trojan side, Apollo, who had aided Hector in slaying Patroclus, continued to protect his favorite heroes, sometimes snatching them from danger or endowing them with temporary strength. Ares, the brutal god of war, naturally gravitated towards the bloodiest conflict, often fighting alongside the Trojans, reveling in the carnage. Aphrodite, the reason for the war in the first place, shielded Paris when he was in peril, often plucking him from duels he was clearly losing, much to the exasperation of her fellow deities. It was like watching a superpowered wrestling match, where the referees kept changing the rules. This direct involvement of the gods often led to surreal and terrifying moments for the mortals caught in the middle. Warriors would suddenly find their spears deflected by an invisible force, or an enemy would vanish into thin air, spirited away by a divine patron. Clouds of mist would descend to cover a wounded hero, or a sudden surge of strength would allow a mortal to perform impossible feats. It made the already brutal business of war even more unpredictable and terrifying, as death could come not just from an enemy's spear, but from an unseen hand. Historians still argue whether these divine interventions were purely metaphorical, representing human destiny and emotion, or if ancient Greeks truly believed in such direct, literal interference. The sheer power of the gods was on full display. Rivers swelled with bodies, divine light illuminated the battlefield, and the very ground shook as deities clashed. Apollo, at one point, even confronted Poseidon, and Athena wounded Ares and Aphrodite. It wasn't just a battle of mortals, it was a cosmic struggle, reflecting the deep-seated rivalries and alliances of the Olympian pantheon. These divine brawls often had little to do with justice or righteousness, and everything to do with petty grudges, family feuds, and who could boast the most impressive champion. It's almost comical, if not for the very real human suffering it caused. The consequence of this heightened divine activity was an escalation of the violence to an almost unbearable degree. Achilles, now with divine favor and his own unquenchable rage was an unstoppable force. The gods' interventions ensured that the narrative moved swiftly towards its tragic conclusion, setting the stage for the climactic duel that would determine the fate of heroes and city alike. The mortals were mere pawns, albeit incredibly courageous and skilled ones, in a larger, divine game, their destinies woven into the complex tapestry of Olympian will. The battlefield, once dominated by the clash of steel, now shimmered with the very presence of the divine. With the gods openly playing favorites and Achilles' rage burning brighter than Hephaestus's forge, the battlefield became less a contest and more a terrifying spectacle of overwhelming force. Achilles' rampage wasn't just a return to form, it was an act of pure, unadulterated vengeance, a storm of destruction aimed squarely at the Trojan forces. He moved with a speed and ferocity that no mortal could match, seemingly invincible in his new, divinely forged armor. The psychological impact alone was devastating. Trojans who had once bravely faced Greek heroes now fled in terror at the mere sight of him. This palpable fear in the face of a superior warrior is a mainstream historical fact of ancient warfare, often determining outcomes as much as strategy. Achilles cut a swath through the Trojan lines, relentlessly driving them back from the Achaean ships and across the plain. His thirst for vengeance was insatiable, and he showed no mercy. He slew countless Trojan warriors, his spear never missing its mark, his sword dripping with the blood of those who stood in his path. The panic among the Trojans was absolute. Their earlier triumphs, led by Hector, evaporated in the face of this singular, overwhelming force. It was like watching a natural disaster unfold, but with a terrifyingly human face. The intensity of Achilles' fury was such that it even extended to the natural world. In one particularly dramatic sequence, Achilles found himself fighting against the river Scamander, also known as Xanthus, which was enraged by the sheer number of bodies filling its waters. The river god, personified and furious, rose up and tried to drown Achilles with its surging current. This quirky tidbit highlights the animistic beliefs of the ancient Greeks, where natural phenomena were imbued with divine consciousness and agency. Imagine trying to fight a river. It's a testament to Achilles' power and the chaos of the moment that such a battle could even be conceived. Historians still argue whether this was a literal divine encounter or a symbolic representation of the overwhelming difficulty Achilles faced as he pushed through the swollen, body-choked river. Achilles, demonstrating superhuman strength and divine protection, managed to fight off the river god, though not without considerable effort. Hephaestus, at Hera's command, intervened, drying up the river with fire, forcing Scamander to yield. This episode further solidifies Achilles' near-invincible status and the direct active involvement of the gods in his vengeful path. It emphasizes that this wasn't just a man fighting, it was a divinely sanctioned force of nature. As Achilles continued his relentless pursuit, the Trojans broke and ran, desperately seeking the sanctuary of their city walls. The plain outside Troy became a killing field, littered with the dead and dying. Hector, seeing the utter devastation, was torn between holding his ground and retreating to protect his people. King Priam, from the walls of Troy, observed the carnage with horror, ordering the gates opened to allow his fleeing men to escape Achilles' wrath. even at the risk of letting the enemy in. The sight of the Trojans scrambling for safety, like sheep before a wolf, was a grim testament to Achilles' terrifying effectiveness. He herded them, harried them, and cut them down without remorse, his sole focus being to reach the one man whose blood he truly craved, Hector. The long-sought prize of Troy seemed within reach for the Achaeans, not through siege or strategy, but through the sheer destructive power of one man's grief-fueled rage. Finally, the remnants of the Trojan army streamed through the Scaean gates, seeking refuge behind their massive walls. All, that is, except one. Hector, despite the pleas of his parents from the ramparts, remained outside, resolved to face Achilles alone. The stage was now set for the confrontation that the entire epic had been building towards, the duel of titans that would decide not only the fate of the two greatest warriors, but arguably the destiny of Troy itself. The long, bloody rampage culminated in this singular, agonizing moment, where personal vengeance and civic duty would collide in a tragic embrace. The plain outside the Scaean gates of Troy, once teeming with the chaos of battle, fell eerily silent, save for the thud of retreating footsteps and the panting of exhausted warriors. All eyes, mortal and divine, turned to the two figures who stood alone before the towering walls, Achilles, radiating furious vengeance in his divine armor, and Hector, Troy's valiant champion, resolute but visibly apprehensive. This was the moment of truth, the climactic duel of titans that the Iliad had been relentlessly building towards, a confrontation born of profound grief and unwavering duty. Hector, despite his immense courage, initially faltered. The terrifying aura of Achilles, especially now that his rage was fully unleashed and amplified by divine favor, was almost unbearable. Homer describes Hector's momentary fear, how he briefly ran around the walls of Troy, pursued by Achilles. This human touch, this glimpse of vulnerability in such a mighty hero, is a crucial mainstream historical fact of epic poetry. Even the greatest warriors experienced fear. It makes Hector more relatable, more tragic, as he confronts an almost superhuman opponent. However, Hector's sense of duty, his profound love for his city and family, ultimately overcame his fear. He knew that the fate of Troy hinged on his stand. He had to face Achilles, regardless of the odds. Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, deceived him, urging him to stand and fight, promising him aid. This quirky tidbit of divine trickery underscores the gods' relentless manipulation of mortals, even in their most desperate moments. Historians still argue about the moral implications of such divine deception. Was it destiny or simply cruel intervention? And so, Hector turned, braced himself, and faced Achilles. The duel that ensued was not merely a physical contest of skill and strength. It was a clash of destinies, a battle between a man driven by overwhelming grief and another driven by unyielding loyalty. Achilles, with Patroclus's death burning in his heart, fought with a savage intensity that bordered on the divine. Hector, knowing his city depended on him, fought with desperate courage, seeking every opening, every chance to strike a decisive blow. The fighting was fierce, each warrior attempting to find a weakness in the other's formidable defenses. Achilles, remembering the vulnerability of his own armor, now worn by Hector, knew its weak points. With a precise, devastating thrust, Achilles drove his spear through a small gap in Hector's neck armor, a fatal blow that pierced his windpipe but allowed him to speak his last words. It was a brutal, clinical end to one of the epic's most beloved characters. As Hector lay dying, he pleaded with Achilles, asking for his body to be returned to his parents for proper burial. He spoke of the importance of funeral rites, a sacred ancient Greek custom. But Achilles, consumed by his rage, utterly refused, declaring his intention to let dogs and vultures desecrate Hector's corpse. This chilling refusal highlights the depth of Achilles' grief and vengeance, pushing him beyond the bounds of typical heroic conduct. It's a moment that makes the reader question the nature of heroism itself. Hector, with his dying breath, prophesied Achilles' own imminent death, warning him that he too would fall at the Scaean gates, foreshadowing the tragic end of the greatest Greek warrior. This prophecy, delivered by a dying man, added another layer of grim inevitability to the unfolding tragedy. With that, Hector breathed his last, the champion of Troy fallen, leaving his city and his family utterly devastated. The long war had finally claimed its most noble Trojan victim, a sacrifice that tore at the heart of Troy. The death of Hector marked the decisive turning point in the Trojan War. The city had lost its protector, its most valiant defender, and its greatest hope. For the Achaeans, it was a moment of grim triumph, signaling the beginning of the end for Troy. But for Achilles, it was a bittersweet victory, the culmination of his vengeful quest, yet one that left him hollowed by the very grief it sought to avenge. The fall of Hector at the hands of the raging Achilles sealed Troy's fate. The plain outside the Scaean gates of Troy, once teeming with the chaos of battle, fell eerily silent, save for the thud of retreating footsteps and the panting of exhausted warriors. All eyes, mortal and divine, turned to the two figures who stood alone before the towering walls. Achilles, radiating furious vengeance in his divine armor, and Hector, Troy's valiant champion, resolute but visibly apprehensive. This was the moment of truth, the climactic duel of titans that the Iliad had been relentlessly building towards, a confrontation born of profound grief and unwavering duty. With Hector's final breath, the battle for Troy, in many ways, ceased to be about conquest and became a grim, personal drama of vengeance and profound sorrow. Achilles, consumed by his grief for Patroclus, acted on his chilling promise to the fallen Hector. He pierced Hector's ankles, threaded leather straps through them, and tied the body to his chariot. Then, with a fierce cry, he lashed his horses, dragging Hector's corpse around the walls of Troy, a horrific act of Hector's desecration. Imagine the dust, the indignity, the sheer barbarity of it. This deeply shocking scene is one of the most brutal moments in the Iliad, designed to illustrate the extreme lengths to which Achilles' rage drove him. It was a violation of ancient Greek customs regarding the respectful treatment of the dead, further highlighting Achilles' departure from conventional heroic conduct. From the towering walls of Troy, the sight of their beloved prince being dragged ignominiously around their city was an unbearable spectacle for the Trojans. King Priam, Hector's aged father, and Queen Hecuba, his mother, watched in agonizing horror, their cries of anguish echoing across the plain. Andromache, Hector's devoted wife, still mourning the loss of her family to Achilles' earlier raids, fainted from grief upon seeing her husband's desecrated body. The collective lamentation of Troy was a piercing sound, a symphony of despair that underscored the depth of their loss and the terrible cost of war. This widespread public mourning for a fallen hero is a mainstream historical fact of ancient societies, where the death of a great warrior could cripple a city's morale. Achilles repeated this gruesome act for several days, dragging Hector's body around Patroclus's funeral pyre, seemingly unable to find solace or closure in his vengeance. This extended period of desecration underscores the depth of his psychological torment. It wasn't just a single act of anger, it was a prolonged, obsessive ritual of hatred and grief. Historians still argue whether Achilles' continued desecration of Hector's body was a true reflection of ancient Greek funerary practices in extreme cases of vengeance, or a dramatic exaggeration by Homer to emphasize the hero's raw, unchecked emotions. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some accounts suggest that the gods intervened to preserve Hector's body from decay and damage during this period of dragging, subtly indicating that even divine beings were disturbed by the extent of Achilles' wrath and wanted to ensure Hector received a proper burial eventually. Meanwhile, the Achaeans began the solemn rites for Patroclus. Achilles, still overwhelmed by sorrow, presided over elaborate funeral games held in his friend's honor. These games, chariot races, boxing, wrestling, foot races, and armed combat, were a way for the warriors to honor the fallen, display their prowess, and perhaps temporarily distract themselves from the grim realities of the war. They offered a glimpse into the customs and values of the heroic age, showing how competitive displays of skill were deeply intertwined with respect for the dead. Achilles, still grappling with his grief, participated in some events and offered magnificent prizes, but his heart remained heavy, finding no true peace. Despite his triumphant revenge, Achilles remained tormented. The act of desecration, rather than bringing him peace, seemed to prolong his agony. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. His mind was consumed by images of Patroclus and the desire for his soul to find rest. His grief was profound and unrelenting, illustrating that even the most satisfying vengeance can leave a bitter taste. The emotional and psychological toll of prolonged warfare and deep personal loss is a recurring theme in the Iliad, resonating with experiences across millennia. The constant presence of Hector's unburied corpse, a stark reminder of his vengeance, likely contributed to Achilles' inability to find peace. The stage was now set for the final, unexpected twist in this tragic tale of rage and sorrow, a desperate plea from the very heart of Troy. For days, Achilles continued his horrific ritual of dragging Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb, finding no solace in the act, only a deeper immersion in his own profound misery. The gods themselves grew weary of his pitiless rage and the desecration of the noble Hector. Zeus, acknowledging that Hector had always shown proper reverence to the Olympians, decided it was time for this barbarity to end. He sent his messenger, Iris, to Thetis, Achilles' divine mother, to convey his will. Achilles must return Hector's body. This divine command highlights a mainstream historical fact of ancient Greek belief, that even powerful heroes were subject to the will of the gods, and that the proper treatment of the dead was a concern of the divine order. Simultaneously, Zeus dispatched Hermes, the swift-footed messenger god, to Troy, bearing a crucial and, quite frankly, terrifying message for King Priam. Hermes' task was to guide the aged king through the enemy lines, unseen and unharmed, to the very tent of Achilles. This was a mission of impossible bravery, a desperate gambit to retrieve the body of his beloved son. Imagine the sheer audacity, an old, grieving king venturing alone into the camp of the man who had just brutally slain and desecrated his son, surrounded by thousands of his enemies. It's the ancient world's equivalent of walking into the lion's den with a picnic basket. Priam, driven by a father's love and the desperate hope of providing his son with a proper burial, prepared for this perilous journey. He gathered a ransom of immense value: lavish robes, intricate tapestries, gold, and other precious gifts, not as payment for a life, but as an appeal for mercy and respect. This act of seeking ransom for a body, though unusual in its context, was a deeply embedded custom in ancient warfare, often used for prisoners or sacred artifacts. He begged his remaining sons to prepare a wagon, loading the treasures, while his wife Hecuba, distraught and filled with fear, pleaded with him not to go. Her raw, maternal terror, knowing the risk he was taking, underscores the incredible emotional weight of the moment. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind Priam's journey, whether it was pure paternal love, a desperate act of statecraft, or a mix of both. Under the cloak of night, guided by the benevolent Hermes, Priam slipped through the Trojan gates. The journey across the battle-scarred plain, past the flickering watchfires of the Achaean camp, must have been fraught with terror for the aged king. Hermes worked his magic, causing the Greek sentries to fall into a deep sleep or become oblivious to their presence, allowing Priam and his elderly herald, Idaeus, to pass unmolested. This quirky tidbit of divine invisibility is a common trope in Greek mythology, allowing for improbable encounters that drive the narrative. Finally, they arrived at Achilles' tent. Hermes revealed his true form, gave Priam final instructions, and then departed, leaving the old king to face his son's killer alone. Priam entered the tent, where Achilles sat with his companions, still consumed by his dark thoughts. In a moment of breathtaking courage and humility, Priam cast himself at Achilles' feet, embracing his knees and kissing the very hands that had slain his son. He appealed to Achilles' own memory of his father, Peleus, and the grief he would feel upon losing a son. This direct, personal appeal, filled with raw emotion and profound dignity, was utterly unexpected. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles was confronted not with an enemy to slay, but with a mirror reflecting his own pain. Priam's words, a father's desperate plea to a grieving son, pierced through Achilles' hardened heart, finally breaking the grip of his consuming rage. It was a moment of profound humanity amidst the brutal savagery of war, demonstrating the power of shared sorrow to transcend even the deepest enmity. Priam's desperate, dignified plea, delivered with raw paternal grief, finally cracked the impenetrable shell of Achilles' wrath. As the aged king kissed the very hands that had taken his son's life, Achilles was profoundly moved. He saw in Priam not an enemy, but a reflection of his own beloved father, Peleus, and the inevitable sorrow that would one day befall him. The shared experience of loss, a mainstream historical fact of the human condition, finally bridged the chasm of animosity. Tears welled in Achilles' eyes, not for Hector, but for his own father and for Patroclus, his unyielding grief finally softening into a more universal empathy. This was a pivotal moment, a turning point where vengeance gave way to humanity. Achilles gently raised Priam from the floor, and together they wept, Priam for Hector, and Achilles for Patroclus, and for his own impending fate. This shared moment of sorrow, transcending the bitter enmity of war, is one of the most powerful and poignant scenes in all of the Iliad. It highlights that even in the midst of brutal conflict, there can be moments of profound connection and mutual understanding. It's a reminder that beneath the armor and the rage, these were still human beings, capable of immense suffering and compassion. Achilles then ordered Hector's body prepared for return. He personally oversaw the washing and anointing of the corpse, ensuring that no further harm came to it, and gently laid it on the wagon that Priam had brought. This act of tender care, by the very man who had so brutally desecrated the body, speaks volumes about the transformation of Achilles' spirit. It was a stark contrast to his earlier rage, a testament to the power of Priam's appeal and the inherent honor that still lay beneath Achilles' fury. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some accounts suggest that Achilles even offered to hold back the Achaean forces for a specified number of days, allowing Troy to mourn Hector in peace, a gesture almost unthinkable just hours before. In a move that sealed this newfound, albeit temporary truce, Achilles declared a temporary cessation of hostilities. For 12 days, he promised, the Achaeans would refrain from fighting, allowing the Trojans to mourn Hector and perform his proper funeral rites without fear of attack. This truce and Hector's funeral represent a sacred pause in the relentless cycle of war, demonstrating the universal importance of honoring the dead, even among bitter enemies. This practice of temporary truces for funerals is a mainstream historical fact, present in many ancient cultures, underlining the shared reverence for funerary customs. Priam returned to Troy with Hector's body, his heart heavy with grief, but lightened by the small mercy he had received. The sight of Hector's corpse being brought back into the city evoked another wave of intense mourning. Hecuba and Andromache led the lamentations, their cries of anguish filling the air. For 9 days, the Trojans gathered wood, building a massive funeral pyre for their fallen champion. They carried out the elaborate rituals befitting a prince and the savior of their city. Finally, on the 10th day, Hector's body was placed on the pyre, and it was set ablaze. As the flames consumed his physical form, the smoke rose towards the heavens, carrying his spirit to the underworld. After the pyre had burned down, the Trojans gathered Hector's bones, placing them in a golden urn, which was then laid to rest in a grave mound covered with stones. This careful, ritualistic burial underscores the significance of proper funerary rites in ensuring the peace of the departed soul and the collective grieving of the community. Historians still argue whether the detailed descriptions of these funeral rites in the Iliad reflect actual contemporary Mycenaean practices or were stylized representations for epic purposes. The narrative of Hector's funeral ends the Iliad itself. Homer chose to conclude his epic not with the fall of Troy or the ultimate victory of the Achaeans, but with this poignant act of human empathy and shared sorrow. It leaves the reader with a powerful message. Even amidst the terrible brutality of war, compassion can emerge, and the universal experience of loss binds humanity together, regardless of allegiances. The 12-day truce, an island of peace in a sea of conflict, reminded everyone that the war, though paused, was far from over. The great city of Troy had buried its champion, but its fate still hung precariously in the balance. The 12-day truce, a solemn pause for Hector's funeral, provided a fragile interlude of peace, but it was merely the calm before the storm. The Achaeans knew their goal, the formidable city of Troy. With Hector, their greatest defender, now laid to rest, the time was ripe for a decisive strike. However, after 10 years of fruitless siege warfare, brute force alone was clearly not enough. What was needed was cunning, deception, and a stratagem so audacious it would bypass Troy's famed, impenetrable walls. This need for ingenuity led to the conception of arguably the most famous trick in military history, the Trojan horse's deception. The mastermind behind this brilliant, yet ultimately devastating plan was Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca. Known for his intelligence, eloquence, and capacity for strategic thinking, Odysseus understood that direct assault was futile. He conceived of a grand deception, a gift that would appear to be a peace offering, but would in fact contain the seeds of Troy's destruction. This reliance on cleverness over brute strength is a significant mainstream historical fact of warfare, often attributed to the Greeks, who valued metes, cunning intelligence, alongside force. The plan was audacious. The Achaeans would construct a colossal wooden horse, so massive it could conceal a contingent of their elite warriors within its hollow belly. The rest of the Greek army would then burn their camp, feign retreat, and sail their vast fleet just out of sight, hiding behind the nearby island of Tenedos. The idea was to convince the Trojans that the Greeks had finally given up, leaving the horse as a votive offering to Athena, or perhaps as an atonement for their long, destructive siege. Imagine the discussions around that campfire. So, we build a giant horse, and then we hide inside it? Are you sure about this, Odysseus? It sounds a bit equine. To further enhance the deception, a lone Greek warrior, Sinon, was left behind. His role was crucial: to present himself as a deserter, a victim of Agamemnon's cruelty, and to spin a convincing tale about the horse. He was to claim that the horse was an offering to Athena, designed to appease the goddess for the theft of the Palladium, a sacred statue from Troy, and that its immense size was intended to prevent the Trojans from taking it into their city. If they did take it in, he would argue, it would ensure divine favor for Troy, effectively turning Greek intentions against them. This intricate web of lies, requiring incredible acting prowess from Sinon, demonstrates the sophistication of the plan. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some accounts suggest that the horse was built from the timber of Mount Ida, a mountain sacred to the Trojans, adding another layer of ironic symbolism to the deceptive gift. The construction of the horse itself would have been a Herculean task. Imagine sourcing the enormous timbers, felling ancient trees, and then shaping them into a monstrous equine form, all while maintaining secrecy. It would have required the combined efforts of countless carpenters, engineers, and laborers, perhaps under the supervision of Epeius, a master craftsman often credited with its design. Historians still argue about the precise dimensions and construction methods of the Trojan horse. Some speculate it might have been a siege engine disguised as a horse, or perhaps even a symbolic reference to an earthquake. Poseidon, the earth shaker, was associated with horses. Once built, and the chosen warriors, including Odysseus, Menelaus, and many others, had bravely climbed inside. The remaining Achaean army prepared their grand charade. They set fire to their painstakingly built camp, creating plumes of smoke that would convince the Trojans that the Greeks were indeed gone. Then, silently, under the cover of darkness, their fleet slipped away, vanishing from the Trojan coastline. The stage was set for the ultimate gamble, a testament to Greek ingenuity and Trojan naivety. The fate of Troy now rested not on a clash of arms, but on the Trojans' willingness to accept a gift from their vanquished foes. As the first rays of dawn touched the Trojan plains, the citizens, after a decade of siege, awoke to an unbelievable sight. The vast Achaean camp lay deserted, smoldering ruins the only evidence of their long encampment. The massive Greek fleet, which had for so long darkened their horizon, was gone. Relief, disbelief, and finally, unbridled joy swept through the city. They had survived. The long war was over. This sudden shift from despair to jubilation is a powerful human response to perceived victory, a mainstream historical fact of how populations react to the end of prolonged conflict. Amidst the debris of the abandoned camp, however, stood one colossal, enigmatic object, a giant wooden horse. Its sheer size and peculiar form immediately sparked debate within the city walls. Was it a trophy, a tribute, or something more sinister? The Trojans, after years of wary vigilance, were now confronted with a mystery that would determine their fate. It was at this crucial moment that Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, stepped forward with a dire warning. He approached the crowd with frantic urgency, his voice booming with prophetic conviction. "O wretched citizens, what madness is this?" he cried. "Do you believe the enemy gone, or think you any Grecian gifts are without guile?" He urged them to distrust the apparent retreat, and especially the ominous horse. Laocoon's famous line, "I fear the Greeks, even when bearing gifts," has echoed through millennia, a timeless warning against trusting one's enemies. He even went so far as to hurl a spear at the horse's flank, demonstrating its hollowness and proving his suspicions. This act of defiance and prophetic warning is a classic element of ancient tragedy, where truth is often ignored. But the fates and the meddling gods who favored the Achaeans had other plans. At that very instant, as if on cue, two enormous sea serpents emerged from the waves, slithering towards the shore. They made straight for Laocoon and his two sons, who were offering a sacrifice on the beach. In a horrific spectacle witnessed by the terrified Trojans, the serpents coiled around the priest and his children, crushing them in their coils and dragging them into the sea. This terrifying event, seemingly a divine punishment for Laocoon's impiety, for defiling the horse which Sinon had claimed was sacred, served as a powerful sign to the superstitious Trojans. It was the ultimate, horrifying confirmation that Laocoon had offended the gods, and that the horse was indeed a sacred offering. Adding another layer to the tragic irony was Cassandra, Priam's daughter, blessed with the gift of prophecy, but cursed by Apollo that her prophecies would never be believed. Cassandra, eyes wide with terror, tried desperately to warn her people. She foresaw the destruction hidden within the horse, the flames that would consume Troy, and the slaughter of her people. She screamed, she pleaded, she prophesied with agonizing clarity, but her words fell on deaf ears. Her curse ensured that her desperate warnings were dismissed as madness, further sealing Troy's doom. This quirky tidbit of Cassandra's curse is one of the most poignant examples of dramatic irony in ancient literature, where the truth is known but powerless against fate and folly. Historians still argue whether the story of Laocoon and the serpents was an actual Trojan belief or a Greek invention to justify the deception. Blinded by their relief, swayed by Sinon's cunning lies, and terrified by the divine punishment of Laocoon, the Trojans unanimously decided to bring the colossal horse into their city. They breached their own formidable walls, pulling down a section of battlements to make way for the enormous wooden beast. With great effort and joyful shouts, they dragged the horse through the gap they had made, past the very spot where Hector had once stood vigilant, and into the heart of Troy. They celebrated late into the night, believing themselves finally safe, finally victorious. The wine flowed freely, songs of triumph filled the air, and sleep, deep and contented, finally claimed the exhausted city. Unbeknownst to them, they had just pulled their own funeral pyre into their sacred sanctuary. Under the cloak of the unsuspecting Trojan night, as the city celebrated its supposed victory with exhausted abandon, the moment for the sack of Troy finally arrived. The celebrations had dimmed, the wine-induced stupor had set in, and a profound silence fell over the city, a silence pregnant with impending doom. Inside the belly of the colossal wooden horse, the elite Achaean warriors, who had endured hours of cramped, suffocating confinement, now quietly emerged. Odysseus, their cunning leader, led the way, followed by Menelaus, Diomedes, and many other brave heroes, their faces grim and determined. It was the ultimate Trojan surprise party, and no one brought cake. The first terrifying act was to signal the hidden Achaean fleet. Sinon, the master of deception, who had been left behind to complete the ruse, crept to the city walls and lit a beacon, a prearranged signal to the ships waiting patiently off the coast of Tenedos. Simultaneously, the warriors from within the horse opened the great gates of Troy, the very gates that had resisted the Achaean siege for a decade. This coordination, executed with precision in the dead of night, highlights the strategic brilliance and ruthlessness of the Greek plan. With the gates flung open, the supposedly departed Achaean army, now returned from Tenedos, streamed into the city. The element of complete surprise was achieved. The Trojans, deep in their celebratory slumber, were caught entirely unawares. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The sleeping city was plunged into chaos, its streets echoing with screams of terror and the clash of steel. The shock value alone was devastating. Imagine waking up to find your sworn enemies rampaging through your home. This sudden, overwhelming assault on a sleeping city is a mainstream historical fact of ancient warfare, where treachery and surprise often proved more effective than pitched battles. The Achaeans, fueled by 10 years of frustrated vengeance and the desire for plunder, unleashed their full fury. They moved systematically through the city, setting houses ablaze, indiscriminately slaughtering men, women, and children. The once proud city of Troy became a scene of horrifying destruction, its magnificent buildings consumed by flames, its inhabitants cut down in cold blood. The descriptions of the sack, while contained within the Iliad as prophecy or later recounted in other epics like Virgil's Aeneid, paint a vivid, brutal picture of utter annihilation. Many of Troy's greatest heroes met their heroic demise during this horrific night. King Priam, the aged monarch who had so recently shown such dignity in Achilles' tent, was mercilessly slain at the altar of Zeus by Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus Pyrrhus. This act, often depicted as particularly sacrilegious, extinguished the royal line of Troy in a brutal, inglorious manner, a far cry from the heroic death of his son, Hector. Even Cassandra, who had desperately tried to warn her people, was dragged from the temple of Athena and violated, a tragic symbol of the city's utter ruin. There's a quirky tidbit about this night. It's said that Aeneas, one of the few Trojan heroes to escape, was saved by his divine mother, Aphrodite, leading his father and son to safety through the burning city, an act that would later form the foundation of Rome's mythical origins. The Achaean warriors ransacked the temples, plundered the royal treasury, and dragged countless Trojan women and children into captivity, destined for lives of slavery. The beauty of Helen, the very cause of this decade-long conflict, was now a grim prize, a symbol of ruin rather than desire. The sack of Troy was not a glorious victory. It was a brutal, destructive act that left a lasting scar on the landscape and the collective memory of the ancient world. Historians still argue about the precise details of the sack, whether it was a quick, decisive blow or a prolonged period of looting and destruction. By dawn, the once proud city of Troy was a smoldering ruin, its walls breached, its population decimated, and its legacy forever tied to the cunning of a wooden horse and the savagery of unchecked vengeance. The long war was finally over, but the cost, in terms of human suffering and cultural destruction, was immeasurable. The victorious Achaeans had achieved their objective, but their triumph was tainted by the brutality of their actions, an echo that would haunt many of them on their perilous journeys home. With Troy reduced to smoldering rubble and its inhabitants enslaved or slaughtered, the Achaeans, their decade-long mission accomplished, finally turned their thoughts homeward. The victorious army, laden with spoils and captives, began their fragmented Achaean returns, a journey that for many would prove as perilous, if not more so, than the war itself. This was not a triumphant unified sailing back to sun-drenched shores. It was a scattering of fleets, buffeted by divine wrath and human folly, leading to further trials and tragedies. This fragmented return, often depicted as a form of divine retribution for the Greeks' hubris and sacrilege during the sack of Troy, is a significant mainstream historical fact of the post-Trojan War narratives. The gods, who had so actively intervened in the war, were far from finished with the Achaean heroes. Many deities, particularly Athena and Poseidon, were enraged by the sacrilege committed during the sack of Troy, the violation of temples, the dragging of Cassandra from Athena's altar, and the general disrespect shown to sacred places. This divine anger manifested in fierce storms, treacherous winds, and navigational curses, scattering the fleets across the Aegean Sea. Imagine setting sail after a brutal war, only to face a furious sea and unseen divine vengeance. It was a maritime nightmare. One of the most famous and harrowing returns was that of Odysseus, whose epic journey is chronicled in Homer's The Odyssey. He faced a long and arduous voyage, plagued by monsters, vengeful gods, and tempting sirens, taking 10 years to finally reach his home in Ithaca. His adventures, including encounters with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the sorceress Circe, and the seductive Calypso, became legendary tales of endurance and cunning. Historians still argue whether the Odyssey's fantastical elements were purely metaphorical or based on ancient sailors' embellished accounts of real-world dangers and unfamiliar lands. Other heroes met tragic fates upon their return. Agamemnon, the supreme commander, returned to Mycenae only to be brutally murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Clytemnestra, enraged by Agamemnon's sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis, remember that early tragedy, enacted her bitter revenge. This grim homecoming highlights the enduring consequences of past actions and the cycle of violence that permeated the heroic age. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers awaited at home, not on the battlefield. Ajax the Lesser, a Greek hero who had committed sacrilege against Cassandra in Athena's temple during the sack, suffered a particularly brutal divine retribution. Poseidon, angered by his arrogance and impiety, caused him to drown, dashing his ship against the rocks. This serves as a potent reminder of the severe penalties for offending the gods in ancient Greek belief. Even the mighty could not escape divine justice. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some accounts suggest that even after Ajax drowned, his body was miraculously preserved by the gods, only to be later found and buried, preventing further divine wrath. Only a few heroes enjoyed relatively smooth returns. Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, managed to sail home safely thanks to his piety and good fortune. Menelaus and Helen, surprisingly, after years of war, eventually reconciled and returned to Sparta, though their journey was also protracted and involved a period in Egypt, as recounted in the Odyssey. It's almost a comedic twist. After all the drama, the world's most famous elopers just went home together. These fragmented returns, filled with shipwrecks, murders, and long wanderings, underscored the heavy price of the Trojan victory. The gods, it seemed, were exacting their revenge for the destruction of Troy, a city that many of them had favored. The triumph of the Achaeans was often bittersweet, overshadowed by loss, suffering, and the continued wrath of the divine. The end of the war was not an end to suffering, but merely a new chapter of trials and tribulations for those who had survived the siege. The echoes of Troy's fall reverberated across the Aegean, creating new legends of human endurance and divine punishment. The immediate aftermath of the Trojan War left a landscape irrevocably altered, not just geographically, but psychologically and culturally. The magnificent city of Troy lay in ruins, a stark monument to human conflict and divine wrath. Its vibrant civilization, its royal line, and much of its population were utterly destroyed, leaving behind a void that would resonate through the ages. This cataclysmic destruction, a powerful testament to the brutality of ancient warfare, is a core mainstream historical fact echoed in archaeological findings that indicate layers of destruction at the site of Hisarlik. For the Achaeans, the victors, the legacy of loss and renewal was equally profound, though perhaps less immediately visible. Many of their greatest heroes perished either during the war or on their tumultuous returns, leaving a generation of their kingdoms without their strong leaders. The long absence of kings like Odysseus led to unrest, usurpation attempts, and societal upheaval back home. The grand expedition had achieved its objective, but at an astronomical cost in lives, resources, and peace of mind. The triumph was, for many, deeply tainted by the suffering endured and the acts committed. The war also reshaped the political landscape of the Mycenaean world, likely contributing to the eventual decline of the Bronze Age civilizations in the region. The immense strain of such a prolonged and distant conflict, the loss of manpower, and the disruption of trade routes could have weakened these societies, making them vulnerable to internal strife or external pressures. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War, as depicted by Homer, directly correlates with the historical Bronze Age collapse, or if it was a distinct, albeit significant event within that broader period of turmoil. Beyond the immediate devastation, the Trojan War created an enduring cultural legacy. The stories of its heroes, their triumphs and tragedies, became the foundational myths of the ancient Greeks. Children grew up hearing tales of Achilles' rage, Hector's nobility, Odysseus' cunning, and Helen's beauty. These narratives provided moral lessons, examples of heroism and hubris, and a shared cultural identity. The events at Troy, whether historical fact or legendary embellishment, served as a common touchstone for generations of Greeks, shaping their understanding of honor, duty, and fate. There's a quirky tidbit here. Despite the utter destruction of Troy, its story endured and even found new life. Later Roman mythology, particularly through Virgil's Aeneid, claimed that the Trojan hero Aeneas, one of the few survivors, escaped the burning city and eventually journeyed to Italy, where his descendants founded Rome. This fascinating appropriation of a defeated enemy's narrative allowed the Romans to connect their origins to the prestigious and ancient lineage of Troy, providing them with a mythical past that rivaled that of the Greeks. It's a prime example of how narratives can be reimagined and repurposed across cultures for new political and cultural aims. The very concept of a heroic age emerged from these tales, a time when gods and mortals interacted more directly, and human achievements, both glorious and tragic, reached epic proportions. The suffering endured by both sides, the Trojans losing their city and their lives, the Achaeans suffering immense casualties and troubled homecomings, created a shared pool of narrative material that explored the universal themes of war, loss, fate, and the human condition. The war became a lens through which ancient societies understood their own struggles and celebrated their own ideals. The end of the Trojan War, therefore, was not merely a military conclusion, but a cultural genesis. It spawned a vast body of literature, art, and philosophy, providing the raw material for countless retellings and interpretations across millennia. The ghost of Troy haunted the consciousness of subsequent generations, a potent symbol of what could be lost and what could be gained in the crucible of grand conflict. The war's ultimate cost, in human and societal terms, ensured that its memory would endure, shaping not just the ancient world, but the very fabric of Western civilization. And so, after navigating the tumultuous currents of divine intervention, human passion, and relentless warfare, we arrive at the timeless shore of the Iliad's enduring echoes. This monumental epic, born from the oral traditions of ancient Greece, isn't just a record of a bloody conflict. It's a profound exploration of the human condition, a masterclass in storytelling that has resonated through countless generations, shaping literature, art, and philosophy for nearly 3 millennia. Its influence isn't just a historical footnote, it's a living, breathing testament to the power of narrative. The themes woven into the Iliad are as relevant today as they were in Homer's time. We've witnessed the devastating power of Achilles' rage, a raw, consuming anger that drives men to both glory and unspeakable acts. This exploration of unchecked emotion and its consequences remains a potent subject for psychological and literary analysis. Then there's Hector's nobility, his unwavering devotion to family and city, a stark contrast to Achilles' personal vendetta. His character embodies duty, sacrifice, and the tragic fate of a good man caught in an impossible situation. These archetypes continue to inform character development in everything from blockbuster movies to quiet novels. Consider the intricate dance of divine intervention. The gods of Olympus, with their petty squabbles, jealousies, and outright favoritism, act as both catalysts and commentators on the human drama. They remind us of the forces, seen and unseen, that seem to manipulate human destiny. Historians still argue whether Homer's depiction of the gods was meant to be taken literally, or if it was a sophisticated allegorical framework for understanding fate, chance, and human psychology. Whatever the interpretation, their presence adds a layer of cosmic grandeur to every spear throw and every lament. It's almost like a really complicated, very powerful family drama, where the fate of entire nations hangs in the balance because someone felt slighted at a party. The epic's meticulous detail about weaponry, battle formations, and the logistics of ancient warfare provides a window into a heroic, albeit brutal, age. Yet, it also offers something more profound, a deep contemplation of the cost of war. The Iliad doesn't glorify combat indiscriminately. It vividly portrays the suffering, the grief, and the psychological scars left on those who fight and those who wait. The mourning of Priam, the anguish of Andromache, the relentless sorrow of Achilles, these are universal laments that transcend time and culture, reminding us that behind every battle statistic are countless shattered lives. There's a quirky tidbit here. Despite the emphasis on physical combat, ancient scholars often studied the Iliad as much for its lessons in rhetoric and leadership as for its descriptions of fighting, indicating its multifaceted educational value. From ancient Greek tragedies like Aeschylus's Agamemnon and Euripides' Trojan Women, to Roman epics like Virgil's Aeneid, the characters and events of the Iliad became a wellspring of inspiration. Renaissance artists depicted Achilles and Hector, Enlightenment philosophers debated their virtues, and modern writers continue to reinterpret their stories. Think of all the subtle callbacks, the knowing nods to Homer that permeate our contemporary storytelling, often unconsciously. Even the very structure of oral epic poetry, with its repeated epithets and formulaic phrases, has been studied and appreciated, offering insights into how stories were remembered, performed, and transmitted before the written word dominated. The scholarly debate about the Homeric question, whether Homer was a single individual or a collective tradition, continues, demonstrating the rich academic inquiry that the Iliad still provokes. It's a testament to the power of these tales that we are still debating their origins and authorship millennia later. Ultimately, the Iliad is a timeless narrative because it grapples with fundamental human experiences: love, loss, honor, revenge, destiny, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. It teaches us about the fragility of peace, the destructive nature of unchecked pride, and the enduring power of compassion. As we drift off, let the echoes of its heroes and their struggles settle into the quiet corners of your mind, reminding you that while battles may rage and cities may fall, the stories that shape us, the human experiences that bind us, will forever resonate. Now, as the long tale of Troy finally comes to its peaceful close, let your mind slow its busy turning. The great heroes, their towering rages, and their profound sorrows have receded into the mists of time, their mighty deeds now just whispers in the ancient wind. The clanging of bronze on bronze, the shouts of men, the wailing of a city in flames, all of it fades, softer now, a distant dream. Imagine the quiet aftermath, the gentle lapping of waves on distant shores, washing away the dust of battle. The fierce fires that consumed Troy have long since cooled, leaving only moonlight on quiet ruins. The heroes, whether returning to a troubled home or finding their final rest on the battlefield, have found their peace, one way or another. Their stories, though grand and tumultuous, carry within them the universal rhythms of life, of striving, and of eventual stillness. The sun will rise again over the Aegean, indifferent to the conflicts of mortals, nurturing new growth over ancient scars. All the passion, all the fury, all the sorrow, it drifts away now, like smoke from a long extinguished pyre. Just quiet, just peace. Rest now.